turn away. The rider slowed as he neared, his horse snorting and stamping. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but as he tipped it back, she saw the man beneath. His eyes were pale gray like stormlight, his jaw rough with stubble. He looked young, though not too young, maybe 25, maybe a year or two more. He took in the sight of her, the torn dress, the bare feet, the red mark on her cheek that hadn't quite faded from her father's last slap. "You all right, miss?" he asked, voice low and steady. "No," she said, and her voice cracked. "I got no one." He slid off his horse in one fluid motion and tied the reins to the post. "Name's Ashford Hale. Folks call me Ash. I'm Keziah." "Keziah Granger." He nodded gently, then looked toward the house. "That family of yours put you out," she said nothing, just looked away, ashamed. Ash didn't press. Instead, he shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "You got anywhere to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "No place." "Well," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I've got a cabin out east near Little Goose Creek. Bit of a ride, but it's warm and I got food. You're welcome to rest there until you figure things out." She stared at him, uncertain. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he added. "I don't do that, ever." Something about the way he said it made her believe him. She climbed up behind him on the horse. He did not touch her more than needed, just steadied her and let her hold on to his coat. They rode beneath the rising stars, no words spoken. Just the creak of saddle leather and the rhythm of hooves. By the time they reached his place, Keziah could barely keep her eyes open. The small log cabin stood nestled against a stand of pines, smoke curling from the chimney. He helped her down, careful and quiet. Inside, the fire crackled. A worn rug covered the floor, a kettle hung over the flames, and the scent of beans and salt pork filled the air. "You sit," he said. "Eat first, then sleep." She obeyed, too weary to argue. He ladled food into a tin bowl and handed it to her, then poured water from a jug. She ate slowly, grateful for every bite. Ash pulled a trunk from under his cot and rummaged through it. "Got a dress in here from my sister. She left it last spring. Might fit." He handed it to her, looking away as she changed behind the curtain he pulled across the room. It was too big in the shoulders, but it covered her. When she came out, he had laid fresh blankets on the cot and rolled out a pallet for himself by the fire. "You sleep there," he said. "I'll take the floor." "You do not have to, I do. You need rest." She blinked hard, trying not to cry. No one had looked after her like this. Not in a long, long time. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded and settled down without another word. That night, she lay awake longer than she meant to, listening to the crackle of the fire and the even rhythm of his breath. Something in her chest felt different, not safe exactly, but seen. And it had been so long since she had felt that. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of birds. Ash was outside, splitting wood with steady swings. His shirt clung to his back with sweat and the sun caught in his hair. He came in when he saw her awake. "Morning, coffee's hot." She nodded, still shy. "You do not ask many questions," he shrugged. "Figure you'll tell me what you want when you want," and slowly she did. Over the next few days, she told him about the man who had left her, the child on the way, the family who had turned their backs. Some nights she cried. Other times she just sat beside him on the porch, saying nothing at all. He never judged, never pushed, just stayed close. One afternoon, a storm rolled in sudden and loud. Thunder cracked like rifle fire and Keziah flinched, curling into herself. Ash moved to her side, kneeling down. "You're safe here," he said gently. "I promise." She nodded, but her hands trembled. He took one in his, rough palm warm against her skin. She did not pull away. That night, as the rain drummed the roof, she whispered, "Why are you kind to me?" Ash looked over from where he sat sharpening his knife. "Because you deserve kindness. Because you were cast out for something that should never have cost you your home." Her throat closed tight. She turned away, but he reached out and touched her shoulder. "You are not alone anymore, Keziah." She turned back to him, tears in her eyes, and for the first time she believed it. The days passed, and the rhythm between them grew easy. He taught her how to tend the garden, how to trap rabbits, how to ride better. She helped him mend clothes and cook meals. They shared laughs and sometimes long, wordless silences that felt full, not empty. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned gold, Keziah stood beside the creek, watching the water rush over stones. Ash came up behind her, quiet as always. "You look lighter," he said. "I feel it," she replied. He took her hand. She looked up at him, heart thudding. "I do not want to leave," she whispered. "Then do not," he said quietly. "Stay." He lifted her hand to his chest, over his heart. "Stay with me." She stepped into him and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she was something precious, and this time she knew she was. The wheat grass along the creek had grown taller since the last rain, and Keziah, kneeling at the garden's edge, brushed her fingers through the blades as if testing the season's patience. A month had passed, marked not by calendars but by the slow swell of her belly and the way Ash's eyes lingered longer on her face when he thought she wouldn't notice. He had started building a second chair for the porch, one with arms wide enough to rest her sewing on. He didn't explain himself. Just whittled pine in the evenings, hands steady, shirt sleeves rolled past his elbows. She didn't ask why. She knew one morning she found him inspecting the fence that bordered the east side of the pasture. A cow had rubbed the post loose, and the top wire sagged where it shouldn't. He glanced toward her as she approached, hammer in hand. "You know how to hold a post steady, Keziah? I can learn." He handed her a pair of rawhide gloves. "Then let's mend it." She pressed her shoulder into the post while he reset the stake, the soil damp beneath her boots. They worked without much talk, but she noticed how he angled his body so the wind wouldn't hit her face, how he paused every so often to make sure she wasn't tiring too fast. After the fence was righted, they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, sharing a piece of dried apple she'd packed in her apron. Her back ached, and she leaned against the trunk with a sigh. Ash looked at her, quiet for a while before asking, "You ever think about what comes next?" "I try not to," she said, pulling her knees close. "But it comes anyway." He nodded, brushing sawdust from his pant leg. "You'll need a midwife." "When the time's near, I know. I can ride into Sheridan next month, ask around. There's an older woman there, Mrs. Kellen, I think. Heard she's helped near 30 births. Might be worth meeting." She turned her head toward him. "You do that for me. I do that because you're here. And I hope you stay." His voice carried no pressure, only the kind of steadiness that made promises feel like something solid. She looked down at her hands, fingers stained from garden soil. Things were growing around her, even when she hadn't meant them to. Later that week, a wagon came rumbling up the path, an older man with a crooked spine hauling sacks of flour and lard from town. Ash traded 2 lengths of deer hide and a small tin of tobacco for what they needed, and Keziah stood to the side, noting how the trader's eyes flicked to her stomach before looking away. As the wagon creaked off, Ash offered her the sack of sugar he'd bartered for. "Figured you'd want it for baking." "You said your mother never let you near the stove." "She didn't." "Well," he said, drawing the door open for her, "I reckon now's as good a time as any to teach yourself." That afternoon, the cabin filled with the scent of scorched crust and overcooked apples, the sugar catching at the edges. Keziah stood by the open window, frowning into the pie tin. Ash took a bite anyway, chewed slow, then nodded. "Tastes like you meant it," she laughed, the sound catching her by surprise. "Tastes like I burned it." "Maybe," he said, wiping his mouth, "but it's still yours." She sat across from him at the table, the air warm with late summer light. He slid his hand palm up across the wood, not a command, not a question, just an offering. She rested her fingers against his, and he didn't close around them, just let her stay there. Keziah stared at their hands. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong." "Why?" "Because it always has." "I grew up thinking the same," Ash said. "My father drank himself into the ground in Cheyenne. Left me nothing but a saddle and a name. I kept riding, hoping to find something that didn't fall apart. Did you?" "I found you." The room went quiet again, not heavy but full, like the hush before evening birds began to sing. That night she didn't sleep in the cot. She found him on the porch, oil lamp burning low beside his boot, and sat beside him. He didn't speak, just reached behind him and set the second chair down beside hers. She leaned into his shoulder and he leaned back. The stars blinked above them and the wind softened. "You think we'll be all right?" she asked. "I think we already are," and she believed him. Not because the world had changed, but because she had. She was no longer waiting to be cast aside. She was building something, one quiet moment at a time, with a man who saw her not as a burden, but as a beginning. Ash's cabin sat quieter in the evenings now, not from silence, but from the kind of stillness that settles when two people begin to live in rhythm. Keziah had taken to stitching in the evenings near the hearth, her fingers working slow and precise along the hem of a cotton baby shift. The fabric was second-hand, salvaged from one of Ash's old shirts, but the needle moved with care, like she believed the child would know the difference. Ash came through the door with a sack of oats slung over his shoulder, boots dusted from the trail. "Ran into a fella near the creek crossing," he said, setting the sack down. "Said a rail cruise moving north of Sheridan, new line coming through." Keziah didn't look up. "Will it bring more folks this way, eventually?" "Do you want that?" Ash crouched near the stove, feeding in a split log. "I want what's already here to hold." She tied off her thread and set the cloth aside. "That fella, did he ask about me?" "No one's spoken your name but me since the day you arrived." She nodded once, then bent to gather the scraps. "It's strange not being watched all the time." Ash stood, brushing wood dust from his hands. "You're not invisible here, Keziah. Just free." The next day broke with frost on the window panes, though the air promised warmth by noon. Ash hitched the wagon for a run to the upper pasture, and Keziah climbed up beside him, the baby's weight changing the way she sat. She didn't complain. He handed her the reins without a word. She guided the team with a steadiness he hadn't expected. "My grandfather raised mules. I helped drive them down to market every autumn." Ash leaned back, watching her hands. "You never said, you never asked." They passed a stand of alders near the riverbank and she slowed the horses. "There's something I wanted to show you." Ash followed her down the slope, his boots sinking into the soft earth. At the base of the hill, half covered in moss, stood the remains of a stone foundation. "Used to be a line shack," she said. "My brother and I found it once, years ago." I remembered the bend in the creek. Ash knelt, running his hand along the stacked stone. "You thinking of rebuilding something here?" She didn't answer right away. "I think I'd like a place that's ours. Not just yours, not just mine, something we build together." He stood and met her eyes. "Then we'll start here when the ground softens." They walked back to the wagon, her hand brushing against his. He didn't pull away. That night, while she washed up at the basin, he laid out a folded paper on the table. She came to stand over it, hair damp, sleeves rolled. "This is a land claim," she said. "I filed it last month," he replied. "Didn't want to speak of it till I knew if you'd stay." Her hands gripped the edge of the table. "You put my name on it." "I did." Keziah touched the paper like it might vanish. "Why?" "Because I want this land to know you belong here same as I do." Her voice was soft. "I've never belonged anywhere." Ash reached across and cupped her jaw, his thumb tracing the line beneath her ear. "You do now." She leaned into his touch, and for the first time she kissed him, not as thanks, not out of fear, but because she wanted to. Because everything he was had become part of what steadied her. He pulled her close, his breath warm against her temple. "You're not just building a home here, Keziah. You are one." Later, when they lay together in the quiet, she rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow, measured beat of his heart. She whispered, "Do you think we'll be good at this?" Raising a child, Ash's hand moved across her back, gentle and sure. "I think we'll learn, same way we learned everything else, one day at a time." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and somewhere in the dark, an owl called low. But inside, the warmth between them held strong as a flame banked for morning. And Keziah, once cast out, now lay wrapped in a life that had grown around her like roots in deep soil, unshaken, unyielding, and entirely hers. By mid-September, the air had turned sharp, and the pines near the ridge began to rustle with the dry sound of coming cold. Keziah spent more time inside, not from weakness, but from the way her body had begun to slow her. She moved with care now, her balance shifted, her breath shorter than it used to be. But her hands stayed busy. She pieced together swaddles from flour sacks and lined a wooden cradle Ash had carved without telling her. He'd left early that morning, riding south to meet a neighbor who kept a small herd of dairy goats. The man owed him a favor, and Ash wanted milk on hand for when the baby came. Keziah stayed behind, wrapping seed potatoes in burlap for winter storage. A knock startled her around midday, sharp and unfamiliar. She wiped her hands and opened the door, heart stuttering. The woman on the step wore a broadcloth shawl and a hat pinned too tight over graying hair. Her eyes dropped immediately to Keziah's stomach. "Granger girl," the woman said. "Keziah, isn't it?" Keziah's mouth dried. "Yes, I'm Mrs. Kellen. Ashford Hale stopped by my place a few weeks back, said you might be needing help soon." Keziah stepped back, letting her in. "I wasn't expecting you so soon. Didn't plan to come till next week, but I was already riding this way. Thought I'd see if you were real." She looked around the cabin, her gaze settling on the cradle by the hearth. "Seems you are." Keziah smoothed her apron across her belly. "Would you like coffee?" Mrs. Kellen set down her bag and folded her hands. "I'd rather look at you first. Sit down. Let's see how far along you are." She obeyed, letting the woman press her hands against her abdomen, gentle but firm. "You're carrying high," Mrs. Kellen said. "That child's got strong lungs, I'd wager. You'll feel it when it's ready. No mistaking it. What should I be watching for? When your back aches like you've been hauling a yoke and nothing eases it. When the ache rolls forward across your belly and won't let you rest. When the room feels too small for you to breathe." Keziah nodded slowly. Mrs. Kellen eyed her. "You got someone here at night?" "Yes, Ash. Then you'll be all right." As she stood to go, she paused at the door. "You've got the look of someone who's been alone too long." "But not anymore, I think." Keziah watched her ride off, dust curling behind the horse's hooves. She turned back inside, the cabin now smelling faintly of dried herbs from the woman's satchel. Ash returned just before sunset, leading a nanny goat by a rope and carrying 2 buckets of feed. He raised an eyebrow when she told him about the visit. "She have anything to say?" he asked. She said, "We'll be all right." He removed his hat and set it on the peg. "She's a woman who says little unless she means it." They ate supper by lantern light, stew made from the last of the carrots and biscuits she'd managed without burning. Ash kept glancing at her across the table, something unreadable in his eyes. "You've been quiet," she said. "I've been thinking." "About what?" He set his cup down, fingers laced around it. "I want to marry you, Keziah," her breath caught. "I know it's sudden, I ain't got a preacher lined up, but I'd like to put your name beside mine in the county ledger, not because of the child. Because I want you with me always." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I never thought I'd be someone's wife, not after you are. You're mine already in every way that counts." She stood, walked around the table, and reached for his hand. "Yes." He rose and pulled her close, not with urgency, but with a reverence that spoke of months of quiet trust built between them. Outside, the sky had turned deep blue, stars scattered like seeds. The wind pressed against the cabin but didn't find a way in. That night, Ash wrote a letter by lamplight, his pen strokes slow and deliberate. Keziah watched from her chair, her hands resting on the curve of her belly. "Who's it for?" she asked. "The clerk in Sheridan," he said. "Asking him to meet us at the chapel before snowfall." She nodded, emotion tight in her chest. He looked up. "You sure?" "I've never been more." He folded the letter and sealed it with wax, then crossed the room and rested his forehead against hers. "We'll do this right," he said. "We'll name the child together. Build the house by the creek when the ground thaws, and every piece of it will be ours." Keziah closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth of his promise, and for the first time in her life she did not feel like something left behind. She felt chosen. The chapel stood 3 miles east of Sheridan. set back from the wagon road beneath a rise of cottonwoods that had already begun to yellow. Its steeple was modest, the bell rusted silent, but the windows caught the afternoon light in a way that made the worn boards glow. Keziah reached for Ash's hand as they stepped through the narrow door, the air inside cool and hushed. The county clerk, a man with a limp and a trimmed beard, stood ready at the front, papers laid out across the altar table. He nodded once and cleared his throat. "We'll keep it short." Ash said nothing, but his grip on Keziah's hand tightened. She wore a simple wool dress she'd sewn in the weeks after harvest, and her hair was pinned back with a ribbon she'd found tucked into the lining of her mother's old sewing basket, the only thing she'd taken when she left. The ceremony took no more than 10 minutes. No music, no guests, no words beyond what was needed. But when Ash said her name, his voice caught just slightly, and Keziah met his eyes with the steadiness of someone who had already made her choice long before this day. After the clerk signed the record, Ash pressed a folded bill into the man's palm along with a small pouch of dried chokecherries. "For your ride back." The man nodded and left without ceremony. They walked the rest of the way home, the wagon left behind in favor of the long, quiet stretch of prairie road. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of distant snow. Keziah's feet ached by the time they reached the cabin, but she didn't complain. Ash carried the cradle inside and set it beside their bed. Keziah lit the lamp and drew the curtains closed. "You didn't say vows," she said after a while, her voice low. "I didn't need to," Ash replied. "Everything I've done since you arrived has been one." That night, they lay side by side beneath the quilt she'd pieced through late September, the stars hidden behind wind-blown clouds. His fingers traced the curve of her arm, not searching, just remembering. "I thought I'd die alone," she whispered. "You didn't," he said. "You found your way home." She turned to him, her hand resting over his heart. "Do you think the baby will look like you? I hope it's got your fire," he said, "and your stubborn jaw." She laughed quietly, then stilled. "I'm not afraid anymore. You never had to be." When the first snow fell, it came soft and slow, blanketing the pasture and the roof with a hush that made the world seem closer. Ash rose early to bring in wood and shovel a path to the barn. Keziah stayed indoors, the cradle lined with wool, the kettle always warm. The labor came late one night, sudden but not unexpected. Ash was beside her before she called his name, his hands steady, his voice calm. He lit every lamp, warmed towels over the hearth, brought water from the basin. Mrs. Kellen arrived just before dawn, her coat dusted white, her sleeves rolled by the time she entered. She took one look at Keziah and nodded. "You're ready." Ash stayed outside the door, pacing the porch boards until the sun broke through the clouds. When the wail came, sharp and sure, he stopped moving. Mrs. Kellen opened the door not long after. "You've got a daughter." Keziah lay propped against pillows, her cheeks flushed, her arms wrapped around the tiny, swaddled form. Ash stepped inside, his breath caught somewhere in his throat. "She's strong," Keziah said, "and loud." He knelt beside them, brushing a curl from her damp brow. "You did this," he said. "You brought her here." "She came out fighting," Keziah whispered. "Just like I did." Ash looked down at the baby, her eyes still closed tight, her mouth puckered in sleep. "We'll name her Ada, if that's all right." Keziah nodded. "It's more than all right." The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Ash rose before light to tend the livestock, then came back to take a turn holding Ada while Keziah rested. They moved around each other with quiet understanding, no need for explanation. The cabin felt full now, not just of sound, but of something rooted, something that would not be shaken loose. One afternoon, Ash hung a carved sign above the door. Keziah stood beside him, Ada pressed to her chest in a sling. He stepped back to let her read it. The wood was plain, but the letters were precise. Hawthorne Ridge, she smiled. "You named it without asking. I knew what you'd say." "You did," she said, leaning into him. Later, as the sun dipped low and the baby slept, Ash poured water into the basin and gently washed Keziah's feet. She protested at first, but he didn't stop. He dried them with a cloth, then kissed the inside of her ankle, his hands warm and firm. She looked down at him, the fire casting long shadows across the floor. I never knew a man could hold a woman like this, not just with hands, with his whole life. Ash stood and drew her close. You were never meant to be cast out, you were meant to be claimed, not own chosen. Every day. Outside, the snow began again, soft as breath. Inside, the fire burned steady and nothing felt unfinished. In the spring, they built the new house near the bend in the creek, stone by hand, timber hauled from the ridge. Keziah planted herbs near the kitchen door and ash-framed windows to catch the morning light. Ada learned to walk along the flat stones near the water, her steps wobbly, her laughter bright. Neighbors came and went, bringing bread, tools, stories, never judgment. Keziah welcomed each one without flinching. Word traveled slow, but it traveled. That the Granger girl had made a home. That she'd married a man who spoke little but meant every word. That their child had eyes like light on water and a voice full of promise.